Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. Here we are hanging out in the third session of this athletic swim through various Canvas gradebook features. Hopefully it feels more like being on a relaxing tubing activity than swimming the English Channel, but grading can feel challenging, so I'm so glad we're doing it together. I'm Nicole Bryant Lescher. I'm English faculty at College of the Redwoods and a coordinator here with 3CSN. And shocker, it's raining where I am. What's it doing where you are? Is it warm and dry where you are, Rebecca? No?
Not at all. It is cool, but we do have a lot of sun.
It is windy. It is windy where Brewster is. Yeah. Sunny. I got some sunnies. Yeah, indeed. I spent about 10 years in the Central West in Wyoming, and more than once was literally blown over by the wind. That is just about as ridiculous as it sounds. It was a funny thing to watch happen, even while it was happening to me. This time of year there, maybe like you all, where it gets windy, if you park the wrong way, you try and open your door, you've got to think long and hard about that and push that open. Yep. Well, as we get started here, I'm going to invite you onto that Google document. If you have any troubles making it to that Google document, just pop any questions or concerns right into the chat. And my amazing colleague, Rebecca, will assist you. Rebecca, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Rebecca Moonstone, and I'm one of the coordinators here for 3CSN. And I will be in the background just doing whatever needs to be doing and observing.
Indeed. She makes it sound effortless, doesn't she, folks? I'll just be back here doing what needs to be done with my, fingers of fury, getting all the dones done. Getting all the dones done. Rebecca is a grandmother. That's why she can say that so calmly, like, oh, I'll just get it done. But you know that she secretly has 8 hands and she knows what you're doing, even if she's not looking at you. So those are the skills that grandparents possess. All right, y'all. So as you get into that Google document, introduce yourself, your name, and the college or colleges that get the privilege of calling you their own. And then work a little bit on the blue side of the table. So under the I got column, something you already know about rubrics or Canvas rubrics. So this could be something about the functionality of rubrics in Canvas, or it could be something more broad and theoretical about that relationship between using rubrics and student learning or giving student feedback. So there's no wrong way to engage with that question. Just a place to get your brain thinking. And then I need, right? Questions or challenges, areas of thinking still to explore for you, or resources you want to utilize. Oh, there's Keelan. I'm trying to find you in our Hollywood squares. Keelan, amazing Keelan. Would you like to introduce yourself and your fingers of fury, your fast-moving fingers of support?
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I was a moment late, but I'm grateful to be here to support, and I have seen many of you here. If anybody's new to our Gradebook series, we're really happy to see you today. I'm a communications coordinator with 3CSN, and I also teach English at Cal State Northridge. So I'm in this struggle with all of you.
Totally. And Keelan and I are busy spending, Keelan and I and Rebecca are busy spending the day together. We've been in one version or another of ourselves and of our learning since 10 o'clock this morning. So we are rolling into the afternoon together. It's like the old days, y'all, where we just get together. We'd spend the whole day together. Amazing things would happen. All right, so let's get going, shall we? I'm going to invite you to scroll your way down to page 5 in that Google document. Again, if you have any trouble locating that Google document, that participant guide we're going to be using as sort of our launch space and our collection space, just text, chat to Keelan in the chat, and she can help you to better access that. If you're feeling like there's so much more you want to say about what you know about rubrics and what you need, I completely agree with you and share that feeling. They're a very multi-layered place of learning, right? Just as soon as we as learners might feel like we've got a handle on rubrics, we learn something new. And then we're like, oh my gosh, I'm a novice at this again. There's so much more here to learn. And so I would just invite you to embrace that. They're a complex and beautiful tool to create dialogue between you and your students about learning. And so if you want more time with the beginning of that participant guide, it will be there for you. You've got so many exciting things to do. So on page 5, and I will share my screen with you now. One moment. Ta-da! All right, on page 5, as always, we're going to start building knowledge by anchoring really to some inquiry questions that lead practitioners to use Canvas in relation to the gradebook, right? So really thinking about the goals and the inquiry that drives using the tool rather than just letting the tool itself drive how we arrive at our choices. So some questions that come up for me as a designer when I'm thinking about rubrics as a topic within Canvas. Kind of how can I make sure that I'm clear about the knowledge and skills students need to demonstrate to meet the objectives and requirements of an assessment? And so rubrics become a really great way for me to layer in clarity for my students about what they need to know, what they need to show me that they know, what they need to demonstrate, so that rubric becomes the way in which I help students to see this is what you need to do, and here's how that reflects your learning. How might designing a rubric help me as the designer to think through what strong student work looks like in relation to an assignment prompt? So how can the act of building a rubric actually help me get more clarity about what I mean when I say I want to see this done well? What does well mean? What does strong mean? How can I make the assessment goals and expectations super clear to my students before they begin working so that they have a guide to support their work? So how might a rubric be something that creates the door in for students to working on an assignment, as well as the door that communicates how they did? How can I use it in multiple ways? And really important, always when we're talking about Gradebook, how do students access my feedback on an assignment? Specifically, how do they see that rubric feedback? And how do I help connect them to that feedback clearly? Because Canvas is not particularly explicit about that for students. So these are some of the questions that guide how I'm going to walk us through and model for you. Recognizing that some of what we're going to do is talk about how to do the thing, right? How to click the boxes. And some of it is about really thinking as a designer, how do you make that rubric work as effectively for you and your students as you can, beyond simply clicking the box to activate it within your course. So I'm going to go model some stuff in Canvas in just a moment. I'm doing a quick, just kind of showing you that there's some anchors here for you later on page 6, right? I'm hoping that you can resist that temptation to click on all of those right now, right? I'm going to do some modeling for you first, but know those are there so that as I'm walking through things, in addition to this recording, you know that there's resources you can consult, right? And I take the moment to do this in particular with rubrics because they're complex. And so for some of you as observers, there's going to be moments where you're like, wait a minute, oh no, I need to see that 2 or 3 or 4 more times. And for some of you, you might be like, oh, I'm okay there, but that thing's a little confusing. And so the same way that I would norm that in my class with my students and acknowledge that learning together can be really challenging because we're not all going to get confused at the same point. We're going to get confused at different points. I want to norm that for our session here. And to invite you, when you have a moment where questions arise, that there's a number of actions you could take. You could pop that question into the chat. Keelan's going to help me when we stop for questions to bring those forward. But you can also note them on a piece of notebook paper, which gives them permission to live in a space where you know you can come back to them and see if I come around and answer those questions as we model, or if these resources are going to deeper dive into those questions later. So just knowing you have options. I find that useful when we get into a complex topic, to just norm that sometimes it gets messy before it gets clean. As I go to model some stuff in Canvas, any questions on kind of thinking about rubrics broadly before we launch?
We did have one question, which was just a refresher reminder about how to save the document for the future. So
oh, wonderful. Yes.
At the end or now.
I'll just while I'm right here, since I'm going to go to the Canvas in a second. Sure. So if you want to come back and visit this participant guide again, easiest ways to do that for yourself. Your screen's going to look a little different than mine because I made this Google Doc, but you should have 3 icons that live to the right of the title of this Google document when you're looking at yours on your screen, your tab. The left is going to be a star. And on your screen, the middle one's going to look like a recycle symbol. My kid loves garbage trucks, so that's what I think of when I see that, but it's like 3 triangles that are all touching each other. And if you click on that one that looks like a recycle symbol, that's a way for you to tell Google Docs that you would like to paperclip this Google document into your Google Docs so it's easier to find. You can also star it. That makes it bubble to the surface more easily. And one other thing that you can do that Keelan reminded me of, and we did in our 10 o'clock session, I just have to remind myself where it is because there's 3 versions of my head in this image. But up at this top version of my head, on yours, it would be the top version of your head, right? You can, your Google head is that there's these dots. You can click on those and you can choose to bookmark. Or press the star here to do it as well. So all different ways to help be able to find this participant guide in the future. All righty, with that, let's go ahead and work a little with rubrics. As a reminder, what you're seeing here is my equivalent of a baking show, right? So this is my design space. It's called a sandbox. No real students in here. The student that you'll see, the assignments that you'll see are under a student named test student, which is just me submitting stuff to my own fake class so that I can play around with it, which is really useful. So I will show you a little bit later how to see from a student's perspective, just to make sense of what you're seeing here. Okay, so let's say that you've made an assignment and you're thinking about your feedback options for getting feedback to your students. And let's say that you want something that you can create that is more universal. Objective is a word I'm not really willing to get all the way into that space because you're still creating it with language. And so there's lots of ways in which it can be a subjective experience. But let's say you want a measurement that your students can see, that you will apply to each and every student when they're submitting an assignment. And you want that to be something that you're interacting with in the same way with each student. The answer for that is a rubric, and they're really useful. They can do a lot of different things. And so if you want to make a rubric, first you must make an assignment. There's a there's a Canvas guide for how to make an assignment in the resources. I'm not going to model that here. We're just going to start from assuming that you have an assignment that you want to add a rubric to. But in order to build a rubric, you're going to choose an assignment. So I'm going to choose this assignment, learning and practice activity. I'm going to click on that assignment. And if you've already built your assignment, you're going to notice that you get, I don't know what else to call it, sort of this third space, right? So you're not at the place where you can edit the assignment, right? I can't type in this box. right here. In order to edit, I would need to choose the little edit pencil, right? I'm not on the home page. I'm not on my modules page. I'm not on that overall assignments page. I've clicked into the assignment, but I can't take action on the assignment. That's exactly where I want to be with an assignment in order to build a rubric. So I'm going to see this option down below that says plus rubric. So if I hit plus rubric, it's going to open up for me. Here begins our moment, friends, where a lot of what you're going to see as I explain this to you over the next few minutes is a portion of my head, whatever portion is visible while my eyes lean in to see this. Sadly, rubrics function almost completely as pop-outs or open-ups when you're viewing. And so that's a smaller portion of the screen than the whole screen. So this is my gentle way of saying whatever time of day is not your preferred, maybe don't build your rubrics then, right? Because it is a little smaller. You got to lean in. It causes a little bit of eye strain. So it's going to pop this out and you can name your rubric. I really encourage you to name your rubric something that's going to remind you of its functionality later. And I'll tell you more about that soon, right? So you could call it rubric 1, but I promise you in a month, you're not going to remember what you used rubric 1 for, right? Especially if you're talking multiple classes over time. So instead, name it something with its functionality. So maybe here, this rubric on learning and practice activity, I'm going to name this practice feedback rubric for short assignments. Okay, this is internally facing. Students can see this, but it's not going to be the major thing that they pay attention to. So it's really for you to be able to find it later. And then I've got my design space for that rubric. So let's do a quick sort of level setting in terms of understanding what you're looking at here. So Canvas designs rubrics based on what are called analytical rubrics. And an analytical rubric is a place where the designer identifies one or more criteria through which students will be evaluated upon, and then uses 2 or more gradients or ratings to give feedback on the performance. So an analytical rubric allows you to create a detail-oriented structure for feedback to your students. So on the left, think about the criteria column as the moves you want your students to make, the overall moves you want your students to make. I know that it's tempting because it's a rubric to think about it as the ways in which you want to evaluate them, which is sometimes how rubrics are talked about. But if you truly want your rubric to not only be useful for you to communicate on what they've done, but also useful for your students to know what to do, thinking about criteria as moves students make rather than judgments you make is incredibly helpful. So to save us some time, I'm going to pop back and forth between my sample rubric and here as a way to populate language. So to see what I mean, I have a sample rubric here. This is part of your resources that are on that Google document. So this is available to you. Everything I'm talking about here, how to think about criteria, how to think about ratings, on this first page of the sample rubric, I explain everything. Okay. So again, criteria, essential elements of whatever you want students to do, right? The moves you want them to make. Page 2 has examples. So let's imagine that my first criteria that I'm going to build is thesis and introduction. Let's say I'm having students do a paper. So if I want to edit that criteria, I'm going to press the pencil to the left. Remember, I promised you pop-outs. Here they come. So I get a place for a description and a place for a longer description. Okay. So the description is like the drive-by. So here I would just put thesis and introduction. This is the move I want my students to make. As you write this paper, students, I want you to include a thesis and an introduction. And then my longer description is literally going to be a longer explanation of that thing I want them to do. So early in the paper, an introduction clarifies the central issues and adds details to create context for the issue. The writer states their opinion, written as a thesis, about the issue. I know this. It isn't for me, right? I'm writing this for my students so that when they look at this and I say the first thing you're going to be evaluated on is your thesis and introduction, right there in my rubric, I've explained what a thesis is and what an introduction is. I could also use this moment to refer to an assignment sheet or a lesson we've done in class, right? So I could say, we discussed introductions in module B, or we discussed introductions in our second week in class. Make sure to check back up on that. So I'm using this criteria as a place to help my students create understanding for what I'm asking them to do. When I've got it where I want it, I update the criterion, and it just pops right in there. I'll get to this range button in a minute. Just hang with me on that. So I can make as many or as few criteria as I want. If I want to add a second one, I just choose plus criterion. I promised you on the pop-up boxes, here we go. So Canvas asks, okay, you're going to make a second criteria. Do you want a new one or you want to duplicate? Most of the time I'm going to say I want a new one, but let's say I'm building a rubric for a discussion and my assignment requires that students have an initial post and 2 response posts. Maybe I don't want to write out the same thing twice for the criteria for the response posts. That's a great example of when you'd use duplicate. So they're doing it 2 times, right? But in this case, I want a new criterion. I've got my thesis and introduction. Maybe here, I'm going to put in main ideas. And then I would have a longer description here, right? Main ideas in an argument. The argument into pieces, or are the major areas of focus in the argument, something like that, right? So again, not for me, for my students. Helps them know what the heck it is I want them to do, even if I've explained it many times in many ways within class. So once I have however many criteria I want, I move towards developing ratings. And these are these centerpieces. Canvas has designed this. Maybe there's a really good reason. Canvas has designed this so that if you want more than 2 ratings, everything or nothing, it builds from the center out, which just doesn't work in my spatial relations limited brain. So what I do is I create placeholders and then I go back and edit because no, it doesn't work. So let me show you what I mean. Right now, it defaults to having, full marks, no marks, but there's nothing in between. In general, in my classes, when I design for either 3 or 4 ratings. You could have 30 if you wanted, but in general, 3 or 4 work really well. So 3 would be, in my class would be insufficient evidence, right? There's either it's not here at all, or there's not enough here for me to judge. Not yet meeting the course learning outcomes, and meets course learning outcomes. If I wanted to do to 4, I could say insufficient evidence, not yet meeting, approaching meeting, and meets, right? Depending upon maybe where this assignment happens during the semester, how much practice they've had, how finite my feedback needs to be. The more categories I create, the more I'm going to need to be specific about what makes the difference between one category and the next. So I want to make it manageable for myself and manageable for students. somewhere between 3 and 5 works pretty well. Let's say I decide I want 4. I'm going to hit this plus button. Here we go with the pop-ups again. And remember, it's building from the middle, and I'm not good at remembering where that is. So I'm not going to actually pay any attention to any of this. I'm just going to put something in to hold it, right? So I'm going to put in like middle spot, or I could put in a period, anything. And then I'm just going to hit update rating, knowing I've got to go back and edit. Now I've got 2 plus buttons. It's still going to happen in the middle. You may be better at this than I am. Just going to put in something to hold it, update rating, and now I've got 4. Once I have 4, I'm like, oh, great, I have 4. Now I can go and edit them. Okay. So I'm going to model how to do that one more time. Let's imagine that with my second criteria, I only need 3. Maybe with this thesis, I need 4 criteria, 4 ratings, but 4 different levels of student performance to evaluate. But maybe with the main ideas, I only need 3. There's nothing that says I have to have the same amount. So I'll hit my plus. I'm going to have a middle spot. I'm going to put in middle spot because I know I'm going to come back and edit them. I'm going to choose update rating. So there's nothing within Canvas that says these have to be symmetrical, right? That everyone has to look like the others. It's determined by my needs as a designer. Haven't forgotten about the range button. We'll get there. Okay. So now I've got my 4 spots, and I can start to build content into my ratings. Before I do that, I'm just going to pause for a minute. I'm going to invite you to think back over what I've shared so far. And I would love to take questions on anything I've shown so far. If you've got new ideas for where we're going and what I haven't shown yet, just hold those. We're going to get there. Anything I can clarify that we've done so far. Hey, Brian, go right ahead if you want to.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the steps you're going through right now, although seeing your really nicely prepared ones is really invaluable. But the problem I've run into when I do this is I go through this, I create my different categories, and like you, I have like the 0 at the end. And I guess it's just in the way I design my categories. As soon as I put them like in, if 2 of them don't do that category well and they get that 0 or the 2, all of a sudden it drops them down too far. Like I only want 3 categories of criteria, but I want, like, if they really just do a really poor job, I still want them to get 50% rather than like a 0%.
You're making my life fantastic with this question, Brian, because you're bringing up a question that's very equity-based in its frame, and it's a wonderful opportunity for me to talk about this. So you can put, there's 2 different ways to get there, and we just got to test it out because I can't remember how much functionality Canvas gives me here. So like Brian, in my classes, I'm really concerned about the double penalty of a 0, right? Like if we think about 100% grading scale, okay? So a 59% is an F, and a 0 is effectually an F minus, right? So when my students get an F minus, if I give them a 0, they've got 58 points of a harder climb out of a hole than someone who failed. And that for me, there's nothing so egregious about not submitting an assignment that would want me to put a student 58 points lower than someone who failed. And so for me personally, I want to raise that floor. I still want to communicate to students when what they're doing is not effective at meeting the learning goals, but I don't want to penalize so heavily that they stop trying. So I raise that floor by giving a minimum credit score for, that's the same for a submission that does 0 of the things that need to be done and non-submission. So I basically eliminate 0s for non-submission. It's my choice as a grader. Everyone has to kind of arrive at their own place in terms of their teaching and grading philosophy, but it sounds like it's something you do, it's something I do, and you can make rubrics do it for you. What you do is there's a couple different ways to get there. Canvas is going to always say that this smallest spot is a 0, right? Because they want the math to work. So what you can do is you can create an additional category. and you just don't use the 0. So one way is just to be like, whatever, Canvas, I appreciate your math, I'm not using you, right? And you can have this spot here. You can have a 0 on it. And you could name it something like placeholder, just put it in there. And then you can make your second spot here the lowest that someone would get, right? So now you have a 5-point scale or a 4-point scale, and you're still giving an incredibly low score if someone does not submit, right? But it's proportionate to those other scores. So it eliminates that 58-point gap. Okay, so that's one way to get there. Oh, you're muted. Did that?
I was going to say that, I think that's what I was missing. So that way, because I always had that 0, I never thought of just making it nothing, which now makes me feel stupid. But you're right. If we had 5 criteria now, and if everybody got the lowest point, and the 6 is out of 10 points or whatever we scored it, it'd still be like, I could rig it up now where that would be, if they got the lowest setting on each one, they'd actually still get like a 50%. And that really kind of solves my problem.
Totally. If you run it on a calculator, right? Somebody who gets 5 1s or whatever, like you're not cruising through that class successfully. You're still going to struggle. But the proportion between the hole that a student exists in and the possibility of coming out of that is significantly less egregious.
I think that was actually my question. I think I just came to it right there, is that a lot of my assignments are like 10-point assignments. That's the way it works. And when you're setting up the rubric, can you do fractions of a point or anything along those lines? Because I think that was the problem, is you had to do a whole point. Because if you had 5 criteria and there wasn't enough points between they did it really well, they did it satisfactory, they did it unsatisfactory, they didn't do it at all, you couldn't have that many criteria. Yeah, so somebody said you could do decimals.
Great question. Okay. I'm gonna table that question for a couple minutes till I talk about some options with how to set up rubrics. The answer that might become useful to you is something called holistic grading. So we're going there. We're just not there yet.
Okay, I'm good.
Great question. Brian has set us up beautifully for me to model that, but also for me to talk about.
Can I ask a question about what you just discussed?
In just one second, I absolutely can. The only other thing I want to say is we're going to enter into a conversation on asset-based grading in just a moment, but absolutely. Laurel, go ahead.
I'm a little confused. So would 0 points be for non-submission?
Traditionally, 0 points in a class is for non-submission. If the goal of the teacher is to eliminate sort of the double impact, the double negative impact of having a 0 compared to, say, having a 59%, right, an F, then what a designer could do, what a teacher could do, is set up this, because it cannot be eliminated, right? Canvas is built upon traditional grading practices that make a 100-point scale, even though 70% is passing, right? So 100-point scale built on a curve, originally 100 years ago plus, suggests that only 30% of scoring would be passing. And so that weights not passing as being a significantly larger portion of the grade someone could receive than passing. To eliminate the really heavy impact of a 0 in terms of students recouping their score afterwards, a move that a teacher can do is to not give 0s, to give a 1 instead, right? Make something out of 5. I'm noticing there's a 4 missing here, but just hang with me, right? Give a 1. A 1 is not a good grade, but a 1 is proportional to a 2, a 3, a 4, etc. A 0 turns into that 0% out of 100% scale. It's a much harder move for students to climb out of. So Canvas, you can't eliminate this 0. Mathematically, if you get rid of the 0, it will turn this one to a 0. You can just build it and not use it in your rubric. You could choose to make 1 the lowest score that a student receives for a category or overall. Does that help clarify?
Yeah, I guess in my world, I teach art. If they did the painting, they'll get some points if no matter how badly they did the painting. But how do I give a 1 for somebody who didn't even hand anything in, didn't show up to class? Do you know what I'm saying? So like that's I'm confused about what is the situation, and probably because of my discipline, what is the situation whereby you would want to give points to a student for non-submission?
Another way of asking that question is, does a 0 motivate? And there's some great research on how zeros impact students that, at least for me as a reader, were illuminating. They're not how I was raised through graduate school. I'm in a different discipline than you, but like you, I was raised with and taught and guided with, let's use zeros as a way to motivate students to submit. And I'm no expert. I'm a reader of recent work on equity-based grading practices, and it's been a process for me. And so probably the best answer I can give would be an invitation to some of that reading to see how it fits alongside your teaching philosophy, how it fits alongside your expertise in working within your discipline, rather than to do more than that. I can simply show you what I do and offer it up as an alternative. There are some resources within our course on that. And our colleague, she is gracious enough to work with 3CSN, Jennifer Escobar, does some tremendous sessions on ungrading that talk about this idea, right? Moving into alternative ways of thinking about grading to give feedback, support student learning. And so those would be some resources that would maybe be a great invitation to kind of think about this, how it makes sense for you and for art, and kind of think about it more.
Thank you.
You bet.
I have a question too. Is there a universal way of raising the floor in Canvas, like there is in Aries, where 0 equals whatever percentage you want it to equal?
Not easily. Not easily. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much in here because we can, like, rubrics are challenging enough to kind of get one's head around. But what I would say is email me. My email address is on the participant guide, and Keelan can pop it in the chat. And that is a thing I continue to grapple with as I innovate and design within the constraints of Canvas. And I am happy to have that dialogue more with you at a separate time as we try and figure out how best to take a system that may have not been intended that way and work it in different and innovative ways that make sense for our teaching philosophies. Totally.
Thank you.
You bet. So let's imagine you've got this rubric. Here we are, we're having this really rich conversation about thinking about grading in different ways, right? How can grading become a way in which we motivate students to continue to try? How can a rubric become a way in which we guide students through the process of completing an activity and or revising or growing in response? And so one more kind of mind bender I'm going to invite you into is to think about pivoting potentially from the traditional way of thinking about ratings, right? Traditionally, what goes in these columns is evaluation of what isn't there or what isn't working, right? So traditionally rubrics, right? Maybe in this number 2 spot, the content that's going to go in there is like, you didn't have a thesis, right? Or your thesis isn't arguable or whatever. And we would call that language, right, deficit, in the definition that it highlights what is not. And if we're wanting to use that rubric to help students to see their product in the way we see it as instructors, it's really valuable to pivot into using what's called asset-based language. And so that asset-based language is way trickier to write, but we're saying what is present rather than what is not. And so I find that it's most useful in asset-based writing to start from the lowest and go up, because that helps me resist that urge to talk about what isn't there. So again, I'm going to come back to my sample rubric because I set it better for myself when I had planning than I can do for you on the fly. But on this second page of the sample rubric, let's go down here to this. My lowest category is not yet, right? Again, I want students to think about that even if it doesn't work well this time, it might work well next time. We're just not there yet, right? Your work is not there yet. So maybe I'm going to have my language here. I'll show you what that looks like. I'm going to edit here at my 1 point. I'm going to hit that pencil, just like I did over here, pencil to come in and edit. Rating score of 1. I'm going to change my rating title to not yet. And then remember, I'm talking about what's there. So here, what's there at not yet? Probably not much. So the bulk of my feedback to students is going to be the moves they need to make in order to be successful, right? So strengthen by adding a focus statement of the issue, right, for your thesis. Strengthen by adding a focus statement of the issue, your opinion of the issue, an explanation to clarify why this issue is relevant and important for readers to learn about and take action on right now. In other words, on the next time you practice, student, when you make a thesis, here's what I suggest that you do. And then I'm going to hit update rating. So that lowest rating, that not yet, is really an invitation of how they can revise. Because there's probably not much that's working there. So I'm talking about what they can do the next time. As I build my way up, if you look at this example, what you're going to start to notice is that once I get into the middle ratings, right, they're not successful yet. They still have places to strengthen. I seem to have 2 blurbs. The top blurb is what is there, and the bottom blurb is how to strengthen. So now my rubric, once students have submitted something, now my rubric is both an observation of at this rating level, what is here, what can I see happening or is in process, and also how do you strengthen to make it better, stronger, this time or the next. So let's take a look at that in example world. I'm going to come to this 2 point. 2 out of 5 is not, fantastic. When my student gets that score, they're not feeling great about that score, right? That's not translating into a percentage that makes them think they're doing all right. So I'm bringing my language alongside to support them continuing to try while evaluating accurately in terms of the range of what they've submitted. So here, let's do something like not yet meets, right? It's not there yet. It's not there yet. And so my language under the rating description, first it's going to start with what is present and then how can they strengthen. Your introduction includes the discussion of a topic and strong statements that move toward a focused thesis, right? There's something here. You've got an intro. You're discussing the topic a little. I can see where your paper is going to go. You're moving towards a thesis, but you don't have a thesis yet. So I'm noticing what's present versus what's absent. You're moving toward that thesis. And then here's my language to help support them. To strengthen, clarify your thesis. Sorry, it's right on the dial there. By moving it from the hypothetical and broad to the analytical and specific, and add sentences that explain why this issue matters right now. Why should readers give this argument their undivided attention? What's at stake? How is this important to society? So again, this rubric is for me, but it's really for students. So when I come to look and evaluate students on their performance, I can say, well, if when I look at your paper, you have an intro, there's a first paragraph, your intro is generally focused on the topic that you talk about throughout the rest of your paper, you've made that move. That's awesome, but you got a lot to go. And how to strengthen is built right in down here for you. So I'm asking what is there rather than asking what is missing. And it's a better exchange for me as a grader. I can exit a conversation with a student's paper or a student's project if I start from a place of what is present. How I give feedback is going to generate much more possibility for me to guide them forward, coach them forward, boost them up, than if my feedback is oriented toward what is missing. And we end up in the same place. It just feels very different for me as a grader and for my students. So again, pencils, going to move you in. Want to see more of what's going on in here? That sample rubric's going to walk you through how to do some of that asset-based language. It takes practice. As a designer, I find I have to get really clear with myself. What do I mean when something meets it, right? What do I mean when I say that this artifact, that this student product meets my goals? How do I know it meets? What's present? And if the best I can do is to say, I know it when I know it, I'm not there yet in my own process. I've really got to do a bit more development personally so that I can articulate what do I mean when I know something meets? What ingredients are present that are going to show me that? Last thing I want to show you here before I take questions, and we move towards the end of the rubric development, is if you remember back here, I promised I would show you. So let's say that you make these categories, and in your mind, everybody's going to, really cleanly move into one of these spots, right? They're either meeting, or they're not yet meeting, but they're approaching, right? Or they've exceeded, okay? But sometimes they just don't, right? You want a little bit of flexibility? The range button is your friend. You can click range. And then you could have a category that's, maybe meets is everything from 3 to 5 because it's an early assignment in the semester. And so to get there is pretty easy to arrive. And so you could have a 5 or a 4 or a 3 and you're still at meets, right? This is how you can get at your half points if you want to, Brian. You can use the range. Not a holistic rubric. I'll still show that in a minute. But that range can allow you, and then when you go into score, you can put in any score. You can click this category and put in any numerical value between 5 and 3.
Where is the range button?
It's over here to the left under criteria. And so when you click it, it magically creates each of these ratings is not a fixed number. It's the distance between the top number and the bottom number within that area. You can also adjust your number over here. So if I adjust this out of 10, Canvas is going to do its best to try and figure out what I mean by making it reflect where it was on a smaller number. Let's go back to that moment where I invite you to not design rubrics at the time of day that is your least compatible with your brain. Because the more that you get into this, you'll be like, oh, shoot, okay, wait a minute. Now, how do I do my numbers? And you got to come back in, right? And you edit again with that pencil. And when you come in to edit, the same place where you would add that title and the rating description, you can monkey around as long as you do it within partnership with the number line. You can't mess with the number line, right? But you can come in and say, maybe exceeds in my class is literally just 10. If you exceed, you got the best of the best. But maybe here in this second spot, meets, maybe there's a number of ways to meet. So maybe meet is 9 to 7. Okay. If we're on a 10-point scale, if we're trying to replicate that 100%, right? Then exceeds is, it's 10. Meets is anywhere from 90 to 70. Not yet meeting. Here, if I want to play around with that floor, I could say not yet meeting is 7 to 5. And then I could have a 0. Notice how when I change things mathematically, Canvas monkeys with me, but I can always decide how I want to enter those scores. If I choose range, let's see if I do it this way. Yeah, I can do it that way. There we go. I have a couple more things to show you down here, but I want to give your brain a moment to percolate all that. And I'd love to take any questions that you have on this part of rubric design up here: criteria, ratings, points, and the range. You got anything for me in the chat, Keelan of Keelans?
I do not at the moment.
No worries, we got other cool stuff to do. There'll be more questions. There's more opportunities. Let's bring us down here. Okie doke. Here you do all this work up here and you figure, I must be done, right? Oh no, there's more, but it's worthwhile. So these buttons at the bottom allow you to think more broadly about how your rubric functions. So up here, you're looking at sort of, you're designing what happens in any one particular criteria. Down here at the bottom, these buttons are about the whole rubric. So to Brian's question, do I have to use half points? What if I don't want, categories out of 1,000 or something worth 3,000 points because it freaks students out, but I don't want to work in percentages either because that freaks me out as a grader maybe, right? I would invite you to think about rubrics holistically. And you would do that by taking the second box and removing the points. So then what you do when you engage with the rubric is you're giving students feedback on each of these different criteria, but that doesn't automatically generate a score. So you would engage with this rubric, click, however they did, see where they exceeded, see where they met, see where they're not yet meeting, and then decide what's the total score. You got to do a little bit of self-norming, right? As you look into activities so that you don't have students that you graded on day one of your grading that get like 2 places where they're not yet meeting and they still get, say, a 4. But then by day 3, when you're tired of grading, when people are getting 2 of them, you're like, oh, you get a 2, right? So you got to do a little bit of self-norming as a grader to make sure that you're consistently giving the same type of holistic scoring throughout your grading period with all of your students. But it's a great way to be able to think about a product as a whole without having to delineate by numbers. I like it. It freaked me out when I started using it, but I like it much better now because it allows this rubric to be a real place of dialogue with me and my students. And I can create really specific information up here into my ratings and give really accurate feedback without having to think about that as being connected to points. It just opens up opportunities. So it's one option. Notice I've got it clicked right here at the bottom right now, but I can just unclick that, poof, and other options come back open for me. When you build a rubric, you build it independent of these buttons, which means you can add them or remove them as they serve your purposes, okay? So notice that here's the points. If I click this box and it says remove the points, it takes the points away. But if you spent 45 minutes figuring out your point system and now you're worried that they're gone forever, nope, just uncheck the box and look, poof, your points show right back up. So you could build one rubric, use it for different purposes, sometimes have the points, sometimes not. It does have that functionality. You could decide that you have a purpose for a rubric where you want the criteria there, but you don't want the ratings at all. Right? You just want to be able to open communicate with students about the criteria. You could choose, I'll write free form comments. And then what happens, what you see when you use this as a grader is you see the criteria here. The rating space is just left open and you can type into it. So you can just give students feedback on that particular criteria. And you're still given a place where you can add points, but those center ratings go away. Similar to when you check the box to remove points, Don't worry. If you did all that work building those asset-based pieces of feedback in the center and you've clicked this and you're like, now they're gone. Nope, just unclick it and they show back up. So unless you come in and you hit a trash can, all that work you did doesn't go away. Okay, it's always there, it's saved. Really important and a great troubleshooting tip. If you've built a rubric, you've got it attached, you click the boxes. Lucy and I talked about this in our last session. Here it is, Lucy, right? You've clicked, I think it was you and I talking about this. You're clicking all your stuff and I'm like, I clicked it, but it's not putting my score in. Canvas makes you choose that, right? It's like an airline that makes you pay for a seat as if you could stand, right? If you want to click on the boxes and have it show up as your score, you have to tell Canvas you want it to do that. And that's this fourth button. Use this rubric for assignment grading. Sometimes I think when you import a rubric or you copy an assignment into a second course, right? You import an assignment to a second course, this button doesn't stay checked. So it's a great troubleshooting check for yourself. If you're grading and you're checking rubric boxes and it's not filling that score at the end, it could be that this box isn't checked. And you just need to go back in to edit that rubric and check it. There's a couple buttons in here that can be connected to outcomes and assessments pieces. My campus is not integrated with those yet. I'm not an expert at those, and I would hate to tell you wrong things. But those are present. There are ways in which Canvas can be linked to assessment and reporting for departments and programs on campus. So knowing those are there and checking with your local assessment coordinator and or your DE coordinator is a great place to start that dialogue if you want to know more.
So we did have a question in the chat.
Bring it on.
Okay. So when students are reviewing a graded assignment, will the graded rubric with comments automatically show, or do they need to click on it to bring it up?
Negative Ghostwriter, it will not show. What a wonderful place for us to go take a look at what students see, or more appropriately, what they don't see and how to help with that. So let's say you've done all this work, right? You've built this, you've taken the time, and it is a commitment. It's a legitimate commitment to build one of these. And so then you want to think about like how, okay, I got this thing. And in the best of worlds, this is guiding what students do. In the best of worlds, this feedback is getting to students. But maybe it isn't, question mark. How do I do that? A little bit more layering on your part can go a long way to helping students to be able to fully use whatever you build here. So I'm going to choose this button, Create Rubric, just so this is launched. And then we're going to go take a tour of things that we can see with it. Okay. So first and foremost, a thing that I always do after I build a rubric, it's not pretty. I could copy and paste all my stuff in little spots. But I'm going to highlight this. I'm going to Control C, or if I'm on a Mac, Command C and copy this. And I'm going to just take this out to a Google document or to a Word document. And I'm going to paste this stuff somewhere. Oh, that time it didn't do it the way I want. I want the formatting. So that I have that language available. And I'm going to build a rubric that looks like this in a document, somewhere other than on that Canvas page. I could take a screenshot of it too, but I want students to be able to access that rubric without having to go to the assignment, so that I can drop it into a handout I give them or into my module when we start talking about whatever this assignment is connected to, so that they see that rubric as I explain the assignment, just like often happens in face-to-face courses, right? We introduce an assignment, we hand the students an assignment sheet, it's got the rubric on it. It is not intuitive for a student to come to the Dropbox for the assignment or the submission place for the assignment and look at the rubric 2 weeks before that assignment is due. I wouldn't do that as a student, right? I would access that Dropbox when I go to put my assignment in. So if, as the instructor, you want that rubric to have its full potential to help guide your students with all that hard work you've done, take a screenshot, make it in a Google Doc or in a Microsoft Word doc, or do a little screencast video where you walk through the rubric, you show it to them, you explain what it means to meet the criteria in each of those areas, and introduce that to them at the same time you introduce the assignment, so that they can start to use that rubric as a way in which they build towards making that assignment. Lots of other awesome things that you can do. I saw some notes on this at the beginning of our Google Doc. So thinking of from what many of you are maybe already doing, think about putting students into groups, have sample assignments, and have them use the rubric to score the sample assignments and talk about why they gave the score they did a week or more before they do their own, so that they become familiar with that rubric, they understand the language, they make a connection between the language and the rubric and the moves they need to make, right? So make it part of a way in which they interact. You can co-create rubrics with students. Google Docs are great for that, right? I've got a sample rubric here. You could start by putting some base language in. You know, you could make the criteria over here and then invite students to collaborate on this and say, okay, what do we think? Does this seem like the things we should evaluate for this assignment? Why or why not? What are some, you know, what makes something meet the criteria compared to something that needs to strengthen? And I have yet to see students be as gracious with themselves when they co-create as I would be with them when I make it. Like, they're pretty tough on themselves. I'll be like, oh, no, in order to meet, you've got to do this. And so making those together, making rubrics together, is a great way to build knowledge about what you want students to do, to invite them into that process. You know, they take it really seriously. Sherry, I see your hand. What you got?
Well, I'm wondering about, excuse me, about printing a rubric. Printing a rubric on its own without, I mean, excuse me, it doesn't always fit in a screenshot. So is there a way? I would love to share a rubric with my students apart from the assignment.
I don't think it does. I don't know. Does anybody know of a way to get it to print separately from a page? I don't know of one. Wah wah, Canvas. Wah, wah.
I think you could screenshot it, or you could screenshot it and put it inside of the assignment instructions.
Right.
Yeah,
I think Sherry was saying sometimes it doesn't fit.
Sometimes it doesn't fit, and I suppose I could recreate it in a Canvas table. But in other words, it would be a replica of the rubric. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I tend to do it, Sherry, just for my own purposes, because I don't love Canvas tables because they're kind of graphically challenging to look at sometimes. I'll make it in a Google Doc first. Like when I design my rubrics, I don't design them in Canvas. I put them in Canvas, but I get really sick of looking at little tiny pop-up boxes. It's not the best way for my brain to work. So my standard is to build just like this on a Google Doc or on a Microsoft Word doc. And I'm going to do my designing thinking there where I've got enough room and I can edit stuff and I don't have to worry that I'm monkeying with something, you know. So I'll build here first, and then I'll just literally highlight, Command or Control C, depending upon my desktop, come back to my rubric, come in with the pencil, and then Command or Control V to paste it in.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
You bet. I see there might be more questions in the chat. Let me just wander you over to the student view so you can see what this looks like. You can see what it looks like from a teacher and a student, and then I'll grab some more questions there. So I'm going to show you what it looks like as a teacher first, and then I'll show you what it looks like as a student. Again, my fake course, here we are. It's the baking show. The casserole's ready to come out of the oven. Okay. So let's go look at my bar to move my Canvas, or Zoom, you're making my life hard here. My bar to move my gradebook is directly underneath my Zoom bar. There we go. Okay. One moment. If you were with us for our last session, You remember we were playing around with the essay on the brontosaurus because sauropods are cool. They're still cool, long necks, weed whackers of the prehistoric world. Okay, so here you are at that assignment. If you choose speed grader, just move us over here. Make room for, let me make room for all of us to view each other. There we go. Okay, so here we are in speed grader. If I go to take action and grade as the instructor, then I'm going to see, if I've attached a rubric, I'm going to see it right over here. And then I can just go to view rubric. I can use these dots with the mouse. Yet another plug for me. If you don't have a mouse, if you've been living with Canvas and a touchpad, now's your moment. $12, get yourself a mouse. It makes this so much easier to do, right? Expand this out. Here's my rubric. And I can just click my buttons. Once I've set this up, I can come through. All my language is there. If I've built this language to not only observe what is there, but offer that strengthening feedback, it takes more work to build it. But now just think about how much my individual comments at the end are easier to do. If all that feedback about what to do to strengthen is built in here, I don't have to type it for each and every student at the end. So front-loaded work means more time later, right? So I can click my boxes. It shows me my total score at the bottom. I hit save. Ta-da, because I clicked that box that says I want my points to show up, right? Use that for grading. It shows up here. And then if you were with us with our last session, if you weren't, don't worry, there's a video. It's attached to your guide, right? Or at least it's, nope, I'm fibbing to you. It will be attached to your guide soonish. It was sent out in the email for this session. I can come down here, and this is where I can give my overall comments, just like our last session, or I can attach something, or I can give audio or video comments, or I can use voice to text. But if I've done a good job on that rubric, and my rubric is providing both the observations of what students have done and my suggestions for them to strengthen, then what I get to do down here in these individual comments is really have a moment of connection with my students, right? I get to say, like, I really noticed you did this, or this was so interesting, right? I get to talk about what they did and what they're learning outside of the context of evaluating them. The goal of what I do down here can truly be about connecting with my student as a person and a learner, because I know that rubric is doing the other thing for me. The rubric is telling them how they did on their assignment, and the rubric is telling them what to do later. So here, I'm just helping my student to feel like a part of our learning community. And, you know, when you got 40 students in an online class or whatever for each class, that moment is really meaningful for your students. And I find it's really meaningful for me. It changes what it feels like to grade, to know that I'm having that moment of connection. And I'm doing it through those bottom comments. This is what it looks like for me. If I want to see what it looks like for my students, you can do this in your class as well. Up here on the right, student view, lots of ways to get to student view. Let me go to my home page so you know where to see it. In most places now, Canvas pops this button up for you on the right. But if for whatever reason you're not seeing that button, come on down to settings. Come on, settings. Let's go. There we go. All right.
We do have one quick question. I'm not sure if this
Sure.
is a good time for it.
I'll let you know
so-
if it doesn't work well. That's okay.
Well, thank you. Okay, so question, where do you put those comments? I have an already prepared rubric, but don't see additional comments.
Oh, great question. Yeah, let's go back there for a second. Oh, yeah, I missed that. Thank you for that question. I missed that. One moment, folks. My my functionality moving things around is getting a little squirrely. So I wonder if my internet's battling to keep up with me at the moment. So if you guys experience, if all of a sudden I don't start making sense, you can't hear me clearly, just type it to Keelan and she can be like, whoa, hang on, Nick, your internet isn't working. Let's go back to SpeedGrader. Oh yeah, I forgot. That's another exciting thing about rubrics. Okay, so I forgot to tell you about this button. In addition to whatever you write in here, in addition to your criteria, beneath the point value score, for each criteria, you also have a place to add additional comments. Click on that box. It opens a comment on the bottom. So in addition to what I have here, when I build mine, if I've been grading a class for a while, there might be some types of comments I tend to give pretty often. I save those on a Word doc and I'll paste those in here. Or if it's something independent and specific to this particular student, I want to drill down a little farther, I can add those here. So each and every criteria that you create offers you a separate additional place where you can add that feedback. And then when you save that, that feedback shows for the students, and we'll go take a look at that now. I think that answers that question. Did I get the question?
So the question then, so it is only on SpeedGrader?
Yes. SpeedGrader is how grades happen in Canvas. SpeedGrader is how grades happen. SpeedGrader means any type of assignment, a discussion, a quiz, although you can't do a rubric with a quiz, those places where you're doing comments or you're adding a rubric, discussion, assignment, quiz, that functionality is called SpeedGrader. Next week, we talk about annotation, which is when you put comments in the margins on an assignment. That also happens in SpeedGrader, but is a more discrete functionality. It's only when students have uploaded something. Does that help at all?
Yes, you received some thank yous.
Cool. Yes. Next week, if you're like, how do I do that thing on somebody's paper or something they upload? Come hang out next week. And as another carrot for next week, part of what we talk about next week is how to make a plan for all the different ways one can give feedback, right? Last week, we talked about all those buttons at the bottom and the role of overall feedback, audio comments potentially, or video comments. So once you have more tools at your disposal, it's useful to try and think about how those tools work together to be functional for you so that your grading is not overwhelmingly time consuming and you're still having really great layered communication with your students. So part of what we'll talk about with margin comments next week is how to make a feedback plan for yourselves so that you're thinking about what each tool can do and using them intentionally so that it doesn't become overwhelming. I partner that in margin comments because I think margin comments can easily become the place where people spend hours communicating with their students on a submission. And that is neither healthy for you long-term, nor particularly helpful for them if it's covered in comments. It's well-intended, but maybe not as helpful as it might seem. So we'll delve into that more closely next week when we talk about theory and application of margin comments. Let's take a moment to look at student view. Here we go, button up at the top on the right. You'll know you're in student view when your entire screen becomes purple around the outside. Thank goodness it does that. If you've ever been in student view at 10 o'clock at night and you've forgotten and you can't figure out why nothing's working, thank goodness it's purple. It reminds you. May have done that a few times. All right, so it's useful to take a tour in student view because it's, depressing, but here's that moment where I show you what students see. But don't worry, I've got things to make it better for you. Yeah, so this is what students see when they click on their grades page. And if you're like, geez, that's anticlimactic, all that hard work and this is what they get? Yup, thanks Canvas, you can do better. Canvas, you're getting a not yet meets on how you give students their grades, right? Canvas, in a very old-fashioned way, privileges the numbers over anything else, separates the numbers from all that hard work you've given on communication. Boo, Canvas, we can do better. So how can we do better? What we can do is help students to see what they're looking at. You already have one of these tools available to you. Right down here in your resources, you'll see this thing. This is on page 6 in your guide. This is Nicole's guide for students to help them access grades and feedback. That is yours. That is swag. Take it. You can just give it to your students. You don't have to do anything. You just push the copy button and you take the link and you put it in your class, and it walks them step by step through how to see their feedback from you, including screenshots, so that they know what they're looking at. And to the best of my ability, I've written it for students and not in Canvas instructory how-to language. My students like it. They have no complaints, so it's working fairly well. I double up with that. That's one thing I do. The other thing I do is I make a 10-minute or less screencast-o-matic video, where just like I'm showing you here, I submit a couple assignments as the test student in my own class, which is a little being John Malkovich, but it works, right? I make a fake paper, I submit it to my own assignment as the test student, and then I grade myself, and then I put it all in here, as student view, and then I show it, and I say, hey, welcome. When you get to your grades page, this is what you're gonna see. And then I can annotate their entire experience of this at least once for them. They might not watch the video, but they might. So it gives me this chance to say, like, Canvas shows you your score, but there's so much more here than your score. Your score does not define you. It is a moment in time. Let's talk about how to think about feedback as a way in which you learn. And then I'm going to walk them through and say, hey, over here on the left, this chat box, right? Or this chat box over here on the right, sorry, that's where all the comments that I've given you on your assignment live. If you see a chat box, here's my feedback. If you see a blue box with a triangle, I've made you audio comments. Okay. And then I'm going to say, hey, in addition to that, remember that rubric we looked at in class that was attached to your assignment, or remember that rubric we used when you were practicing on sample assignments in your group? There it is, filled out for you. I'm going to click on that thing that looks like a clipboard. It's going to show up. Let me grab it for an assignment we've done. Here's Brontosauruses. Here we go, you can see it. So when it's been completed for students, they'll know which category they've received, not only from their score, but by this built-in arrow system. Canvas didn't ask me if I would like to make low scores red and middle scores orange and good scores green. They didn't ask my opinion on that. I'd have one. It wouldn't be pleasant, but whatever. It's the best I can do to offset sort of the negative implications of red, and students see red. We'll talk more about that with margin comments next week. Red pens follow our students into adulthood from their early learning. They follow us too. So that's how they can see everything. I can't make it perfect, but by making that video for my students and attaching that guide for how they see their feedback, I can demystify the process a big piece. I also send an announcement anytime that I'm done grading something. I give some overall impressions, a couple sentences. Overall, I noticed y'all are here, or this is what seems, these are the things that generally folks struggled with. That's completely appropriate for where we are in the class, right? Something to norm that experience. I put it out in an announcement. I remind them, I link the video or the guide. I remind them to look at their feedback. So I'm just creating all that wraparound communication to go along with it.
So we had one more question
Sure.
that was about saving and retrieving rubrics. Would you be able to show that again?
Oh my goodness, yes, thank you. Y'all are awesome.
I know.
Later today, when I'm in a meeting that I absolutely do not have the brain for right now, would some of you please come with me so that when I forget to say something, you can ask a question and remind me, because I'm going to need it. I'm going to need it. Yes, indeedy do. Okay. All righty. Oh, I don't want to go there. Let me go back to assignments. Okay. I don't know why Canvas is not, yeah, okay, that'll be good enough. There we go. All right. So let's say I work really hard to make a rubric and I've done what Nick tells you to do, which is to name your rubric something so you can find it later. That's only good if you remember to find it, but here we go. Let's say I want to build a new assignment, okay? This is a great example too. I'll show you how to do it with a discussion. You can attach rubrics to discussions, but if you're like, man, when I look for a discussion, I don't see the thing that says plus rubric. It's because Canvas has hidden it on you. Let me show you where it is. If you're in a discussion, right? Remember, if you were in an assignment, you'd see that button down here that says plus rubric. If you're in a discussion and you want to add a rubric, you got to come over to these 3 dots on the right. Your discussion has to be a graded discussion. Okay. You can't put a rubric on an ungraded discussion. You can make a discussion worth 0 points. So there are ways to still make a discussion for discussion purposes only and end up with a rubric. You just got to work around Canvas a little. But if it's a graded discussion, you come up to this button, choose Show Rubric or Add Rubric. In this case, there's already one here, but let's get rid of this one so that you can see what it looks like. Okay. Show Rubric, I get a pop-up, always a pop-up. And I say Add Rubric. But let's say, I built a rubric last week. I think it'd work pretty well for my discussions. Maybe it's not perfect, but I think it's a good start, right? What I can do is come up here to the right, find a rubric. Get excited, folks. When you hit find a rubric, every course you've ever taught online, and now I'm feeling like I've been doing this for a while. Whoa, there's a lot in there. Anyway, every course you've ever done online affiliated with this Canvas account that your district allows you to still interact with. I know that's a lot of caveats. Your district might have a point of no return where, like, if it was 5 years ago or whatever, you can't interact with that particular section anymore. But for everything that you can still interact with, it all shows up. And now naming those rubrics something you can remember for usefulness becomes more important. So if you notice over here, I've got a rubric called Decoding Activity. I've got one called Discussion Forum Scoring Rubrics. I'm like, oh, I used that last semester. I bet that would work here. I can click on it. It gives me this microscopic preview, which may or may not be helpful, but I can choose this button down here at the bottom that says use this rubric. And here it is, but I don't have to take it as is. It only had to be good enough to get me started. I can still come in with this pencil and adjust anything I want. So sometimes I transfer rubrics over because they have the language in them that I'm going to want for my next purpose. Sometimes I transfer a rubric over because it literally has the amount of criteria spots and rating spots I'm going to need. It doesn't have to be perfect because I can still come in and edit or change everything in here. And when I edit and change, I'm editing and changing it for this particular use. It does not edit or change the original place of that rubric. Okay. So I can come in and edit and change this here, and it does not impact that original one. So I could use the same base rubric for 3 different assignments in my class and have 3 different versions of it living out there. The first version I built, the second 2 I copied and adjusted. This makes the lift much less, right? I'm no longer in a place where every time I'm having to build from scratch. Hard thinking, but at least over time it gets easier. Great question. We're arriving to the end of our time, folks. There's so much more we could talk about. I'm going to let those resources talk in part for me. Everything we've walked through here either lives in the how-to guides on the right or in some of these places of theory on the left. Within our YouTube channel, there's some great copies of the sessions by Jennifer Escobar on ungrading that are a great next step to stop in and think about. Oh my gosh, our Gots and Needs table isn't here. Well, fiddle-dee-dee on that. What would be lovely if you're comfortable doing so, since I made an editing snafu here? It'd be lovely if in the chat, if you've got a moment, if there's something you got from this session, something really rich, just type it into the chat. If there's something you need, additional resources, questions that are lingering for you, pop it in the chat. Keelan and I will assemble that information into what is usually living right here in the participant guide. Whoops. But we'd love your impressions, your takeaways. Helps us continue to design and support you more the next time.
We are super grateful for you all being here, and we just want to remind you that we will do this again and that we will learn each time together. Because sometimes I know from my perspective, I get so much out of, first of all, the questions that everybody shares, and just, oh my goodness.
Totally. And no rubric is, I mean, like, I'm in process. I know Keelan feels this way too. Like, the more I learn, the more I know I have to learn, and I just go in for another round. And if I look back at a rubric from last semester and I'm like, ah, geez, that didn't look the way I wanted, or I have a better way of saying that now, or whatever, like, that's just part of the process, right? We are where we are, and we learn from where we are. So next week, again, is annotation, which is all things related to communicating right on a document that students have submitted. Does not have to be a paper, right? They could submit their typed out equations. They could submit something they took a photo of and upload it as a photo or upload it as a PDF. There's lots of ways to use annotation as a opportunity for feedback. So I hope you'll join us next week. Talk about making feedback plans. And I hope between now and then you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your week.